There is a particular quality to the Tuscan hills at night. During the day, they are postcard Italy, the rolling landscape of vineyards and cypress trees and medieval villages perched on ridgelines, the landscape that painters have been reproducing for 5 centuries, because it seems to contain within its gentle contours something essential about the idea of beauty itself. But at night the hills change. The valleys between them deepen into shadow. The narrow roads that wind up through the olive groves and the pine woods become corridors without exits, and the small unpaved turnouts and parking areas that appear here and there along those roads, half hidden by vegetation, invisible from the road unless you know where to look, become places of a particular, sheltered privacy that young couples in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s sought out when they had nowhere else to go. They were called luoghi del delirio in the Italian press, eventually, lovers' lanes, places where people drove at night for the specific kind of privacy that the hilltop towns and the shared apartments and the vigilance of family could not provide, places where the darkness and the isolation and the beauty of the surrounding landscape all conspired to make the world outside the car feel temporarily irrelevant. The Florentine hills are full of such places, have always been full of them. For nearly 2 decades, those places were where something came to find young couples parked in cars on warm nights, something that arrived without warning in the dark and left behind it a scene that the investigators who responded to the calls, men who were not unacquainted with violence, described again and again with a specificity of shock that suggests they were never able to entirely absorb what they saw. Not with practice, not with the accumulating experience of the years. This is the story of the Monster of Florence. It is not a story that ends cleanly or resolves into the satisfying shape of justice delivered and truth established, because this is not that kind of story. It is a story about 16 people who died in the hills above one of the most beautiful cities in the world between 1968 and 1985, killed by a person or persons who were never definitively identified, never conclusively tried, never formally held accountable for what the evidence at each scene made unmistakably clear. It is also a story about an investigation that became, across decades of pursuit, something stranger and more disturbing in its own way than the investigation of any single killer should become. A story about the machinery of Italian justice, about false accusations and political pressure and conspiracy theories so baroque they seem designed to prevent understanding rather than produce it. It is a story about what happens when a society decides that the horror it is confronting is too large to be contained in any single explanation, and therefore reaches, again and again, for explanations that are larger still. And it is a story about 16 specific people, 8 couples, who drove up into the hills on summer nights and were destroyed there, and who deserve, before anything else is said about the case that carries their killer's name instead of theirs, to be understood as having been the center of this story rather than its peripheral detail. To understand what was happening in the hills above Florence during those years, you have to understand something about the particular world in which those hills existed. Italy in the late 1960s was a country in profound social transition, a country whose traditional Catholic conservatism was being disrupted by the same cultural upheavals that were reshaping the West more broadly, a country where the old rules about courtship and sexuality and privacy were loosening at the edges even as they remained formally intact in the domestic spaces where most young Italians still lived. The post-war generation had not fully broken from its parents' world, but it was trying to, and the physical space of that attempt, the negotiation between the new and the old, played out in places where neither fully held jurisdiction. The back roads of the Florentine hills, the dark turnouts off the provincial roads, the unpaved tracks through the pine woods that led to views of the city below, were among those spaces. They were where a generation went when the apartment was too small, and the family too present, and the world too watchful, and for most people who went to them, they were simply where young life happened, private and unremarkable. They became something else when something started moving through them, and what made what happened in those hills so peculiarly and lastingly frightening was not simply the violence, terrible as it was, but the pattern, the persistence, the fact that whatever it was came back, not once or twice, but 8 times across 17 years, always to the same kind of place, always at night, always to a parked car, always to a young couple who had no reason to believe they were in danger, and always with the same weapon. Always, across the entire span of the murders, the same gun. A .22 long rifle caliber pistol, a Beretta Model 70 series, identified by the consistent ballistic signature of the weapon's rifling left on each of the spent casings recovered from each scene across the years. The casing signature was so consistent, so unmistakable to the forensic analysts who examined it across the crime scenes of the 1970s and 1980s, that it became the single thread of physical evidence connecting the murders to a common source, even when everything else about the investigation led in circles. The gun was the constant. The gun was always there. The gun, in some ways, is the case, because without it, the pattern might not have been recognized when it was, and the question of who held it has been the driving question of Italian criminal investigation for more than 50 years, without producing an answer that satisfies. The first of the murders, attributed to the Monster of Florence, happened in August of 1968, in the village of Signa, on the outskirts of the Florentine basin, and it happened in circumstances that were already more complicated than the later crimes would be, complicated in ways that would shape the investigation in the years that followed and contribute to the extraordinary confusion that would come to define it. Antonio Lobianco was a 29-year-old tile worker. Barbara Locci was the 23-year-old woman he was having an affair with, a woman whose marriage to a Sardinian immigrant named Stefano Mele had produced a 6-year-old son named Natalino, who was, on the night of the 21st of August, 1968, in the back seat of the car in which his mother and her lover died. Natalino Mele survived the attack. He was found by a local resident wandering a road in the small hours of the morning, and what he told the investigators who found him, or rather what he seemed to tell them through the specific and shifting accounts of a traumatized 6-year-old, would become one of the long-running puzzles of the case, because his account appeared to implicate, at different moments, different people. The murders themselves were carried out with a pistol, the same pistol that would fire into car windows across the Florentine countryside for the next 17 years. Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci were shot inside the vehicle. Their deaths were rapid. The barbarity of the subsequent attacks, the anatomical violations visited on female victims that would become a terrible signature of the later crimes, were not present at Signa in 1968, and this absence has been noted by researchers ever since, as evidence either that the 1968 murders were the work of a different perpetrator who used the same gun, a possibility that complicates the entire case structure, or that the monster was in some sense still developing in 1968, that the violence had not yet arrived at the specific and purposeful form it would take in the years that followed. Stefano Mele, the cuckolded husband, was arrested and eventually confessed to the Signa murders, but his confession was self-contradictory and he later recanted it, and the forensic evidence did not definitively support it. He was nonetheless convicted and spent time in prison before being released. His name and the names of various Sardinian immigrants from his social circle, who became collectively known in the investigation as the Sardinian Trail, would surface again and again in the decades that followed, as investigators tried to trace the gun from its origin in the Sardinian criminal underworld through the hands of various owners to whoever had ultimately carried it into the hills above Florence and used it across 8 crime scenes spanning nearly 2 decades. The Sardinian Trail is one of the most genuinely confusing threads in a case that has never been short of confusing threads. There is credible evidence that the gun used in the monster killings was previously used in the murder of a man in Sardinia in the 1960s, which would mean the weapon traveled from the island to the mainland with Sardinian immigrants who settled in the Florentine basin, and from there passed, through some chain of transactions or thefts that investigators have never been able to fully reconstruct, into the hands of the person who used it to kill 8 couples. Whether the same person who killed Lo Bianco and Loci in 1968 was the person who killed the 7 couples who followed is a question that remains unresolved, or the seems a Lo Bianco, Menefier, and whether the same person, the same 6 years passed between Signa and the next murder that Italian investigators would eventually attribute to the Monster of Florence. 6 years is a long time, long enough that the Signa killing, which had been investigated as a domestic crime in the immediate moment of its occurrence, had receded into the background of the case record when the second attack happened in September of 1974 on a road near Borgo San Lorenzo in the Mugello Valley north of Florence. Pasquale Gentilcore was 19 years old. Stefania Pettini was 18. They were parked in a quiet spot off the Borgo San Lorenzo road on the evening of the 14th of September 1974 when they were attacked. The specific brutality of the assault on Stefania Pettini, who was stabbed multiple times after being shot, with a violence that went far beyond the act of killing and suggested a rage or a compulsion or a specific and terrible purpose that the investigation would struggle for years to characterize or explain, was what first made investigators understand that they were dealing with something qualitatively different from an ordinary homicide. The post-mortem violence, the ferocity of it, the sense, communicated through the evidence at the scene to the investigators who arrived in the early morning hours, that whoever had done this had not simply killed, but had spent time there in the dark with the bodies, doing something else entirely. Italy, in 1974, was a country in crisis of a different order from the social transition of the late 60s. The years of lead, the anni di piombo, were underway, the period of political violence between far-left and far-right groups that would mark the decade with bombings and assassinations and kidnappings and a general atmosphere of political instability that made Italian institutions feel besieged from multiple directions. In this context, the murders of 2 teenagers on a country road, however terrible, were competing for investigative attention and public horror with events that seemed, in the immediate moment, more systemically threatening. The local carabinieri and the polizia were dealing, in the hills above Florence, with something they did not yet understand, had not yet connected to the Signa murders of 6 years earlier, and would not for some time recognize as the beginning of a pattern that would eventually demand the resources and the attention of an entire investigative apparatus. The gap between 1974 and the next cluster of murders, which came in 1981, is itself something that the investigators and researchers who have spent careers on this case have never satisfactorily explained. Were there killings in the intervening years that were not attributed to the monster? Were there attempts that failed and were never reported? Did something in the killer's circumstances change between 1974 and 1981 that created the gap, a period of incarceration for an unrelated offense, a change in living situation, something else entirely? The gap is a space in the record that everyone has noticed and no one has been able to fill with anything more substantial than speculation. What is certain is that in the summer and autumn of 1981, the pattern resumed with a frequency that made the connection undeniable and the crisis acute. 2 double murders in a single season, the first on the 3rd of June and the second on the 23rd of October, both within a short drive of Florence, both on isolated roads, both couples shot in their car with the same weapon whose ballistic signature the forensic analysts now recognized immediately because they had seen it in 1974 and they had read the files from 1968, and they understood, with the cold certainty that forensic evidence produces, that these were not separate crimes. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela De Nuccio were killed in June, parked off a road near Scandicci. Carmela De Nuccio was 21 years old, a woman who, by all accounts, her family and friends have given in the years since, was full of the specific vitality that 21-year-olds have when everything about the future still feels possible. Giovanni Foggi was 30. They were parked in a spot that the local geography made seem private enough, that the dark and the surrounding countryside made feel distant enough from everything, and they were found the following day, in the circumstances that were by then becoming, for the investigators who arrived at such scenes, devastatingly familiar. In October, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi were killed near Calenzano. Susanna Cambi was 24 years old. Stefano Baldi was 26. Their deaths followed the pattern. The gun was the same gun. The anatomy of the crime scene carried the same terrible signature. The investigators who worked these cases have said, in various accounts given over the years, that the experience of arriving at the scene of the October murders, having already worked the June murders, having already recognized the weapon and the method, was a particular kind of horror, the horror of recognition, of knowing what you are about to find before you find it, which is in some ways worse than the horror of discovery because it removes the last possible distance between the investigator and the reality of what is happening. 1982, the attack on Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, near Montespertoli, added another dimension of cruelty to the case record, one that has stayed in the accounts of the investigation ever since because of what it suggested about the nature of the killer's patience and control. Paolo Mainardi was 22 years old, a young mechanic. Antonella Migliorini was 20 years old. When they were attacked, Mainardi apparently managed to start the car in the moment of panic that the attack produced, and the car moved before coming to a stop. He was still alive when investigators reached the scene, still alive for long enough that there was a period, a terrible and suspended period, when it seemed possible that he might survive to describe what he had seen. He did not. He died without recovering consciousness, without providing the investigators who kept vigil at his bedside the account that would have changed everything. What the investigators understood from the scene, from the way the car had moved and come to rest, was that the killer had not been panicked by the car's movement, had not fled when the situation became unpredictable. He had followed, or waited, or managed the situation with a composure that in retrospect was more disturbing than flight would have been, because it spoke to a capacity for control under pressure that made the usual investigative assumption that killers reveal themselves through the disorder of panic less applicable here than in most cases. Whatever this person was, they were not someone who panicked. They were someone who stayed. By 1982, the case had a name. The Italian press had named the killer the Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence, and the name had taken hold in the way that journalistic names for serial killers do, becoming the frame through which every subsequent development was understood and reported. The name was useful for the press and for the public consciousness, but complicated for the investigation, because it created a specific identity for something that had no identified person behind it, a persona without a face, And the process of trying to attach that persona to a face would consume Italian law enforcement for decades, would produce false accusations and wrongful prosecutions, and at least one death that was directly attributable to the pressure of the case, and would ultimately fail to deliver the definitive answer that the case demanded. The summer of 1983 introduced an element to the case that shifted the nature of the international attention it was receiving, because the victims in the sixth double murder were not Italian. Horst Wilhelm Meyer and Uwe Rüdiger Rusch were German tourists, two young men who had been traveling in Tuscany and who were parked in a secluded spot near Galuzzo on the southern outskirts of Florence on the night of the 6th of September. Their deaths produced a diplomatic dimension to the investigation that the Italian authorities had not previously had to manage, a German government and German families asking questions and expecting answers in a case that had already demonstrated its capacity for producing neither. The fact that the victims were two men, rather than the male-female couples of every other crime in the series, raised immediate questions about the killer's awareness of who was in the car before the attack began, and about the nature of the specific targeting the other crimes appeared to involve. Some investigators have suggested that the monster attacked the German tourists in error, that the couple in the car was ambiguous enough in the darkness, that a killer specifically targeting male-female couples did not realize his mistake until after the attack was already underway. Others have argued that the attack on two male tourists represented evidence against the specific psychological profile that the other crimes appeared to suggest, evidence that the targeting was less specific than it appeared, or that there may have been more than one perpetrator acting across the series of crimes, each with a slightly different profile and slightly different motivation. The possibility of multiple perpetrators, sometimes called the compagni di menda theory, after a phrase that would become significant in the investigation's later years, was already being discussed by investigators at this point, though it would not take its fullest and most elaborate form until considerably later. In June of 1984, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini were killed near the village of Vicchio in the Mugello Valley, the same general territory where the 1974 murders had occurred. Claudio was 21 years old. Pia was 18, which is to say she was a child by most measures, the youngest of the monster's female victims, a fact that the accounts of her family have returned to repeatedly in the decades since. The anatomical violation in this case was carried out with a particular and terrible precision that had investigators once again confronting the question of what the removal of specific anatomical material from the bodies of female victims meant about the person or persons responsible. Was it a trophy? Was it evidence of a specific sexual pathology that the broader investigation had been trying to define? Was it, as the more Baroque theories that were already beginning to circulate in investigative circles proposed, material being collected for delivery to someone else, someone with a specific demand that the killer was satisfying? That last theory, the theory of the external recipient, the idea that someone above the killer, in some hierarchy of horror, was requesting or requiring the anatomical material as evidence of the kills, was one that would grow in the years that followed into something that consumed the investigation and arguably derailed it. But in the summer of 1984, it was still a speculation, competing with other speculations, a dark possibility in a case already full of dark possibilities. And then September of 1985, and the last of the confirmed monster murders, and the piece of evidence that was so specific in its horror, so deliberately, communicatively terrible, that it changed the character of the case from an investigation into a correspondence. Jean-Michel Krabeshvili was 25 years old. Nadine Moriot was 36. They were French tourists, camping in a field near the village of Scopeti in the Chianti Hills when they were attacked on the 8th of September, 1985. Their tent was in a secluded area of a larger camping site, set apart from the other campers in the darkness. They were found the following day in circumstances that the investigators who responded described as, in the specific weight of that word, under these specific circumstances, the worst they had seen. Nadine Moriot was the victim of the most severe of the post-mortem violations yet recorded in the series. On the 17th of October 1985, Silvia della Monica, a Florentine magistrate who had become the public face of the investigation, received a package in the mail. Package contained a letter and, wrapped inside it, a piece of Nadine Moriot's anatomy that had been removed from her body at the scene at Scopetti. The letter was written in a hand that investigators analyzed extensively. The text of it, which was short and specific in its horror, communicated something about the sender that the previous 17 years of investigation had never produced: a direct address, a deliberate communication, a voice. Whoever sent the package to the magistrate wanted to be known, on their own terms, in a way they had not previously demonstrated. They wanted the magistrate to have something that only the killer could have sent. They wanted acknowledgement of what they were, and they were sending it through a human organ in a paper wrapping to the woman whose job it was to find them. The package changed the public atmosphere around the case in a way that nothing before it had quite managed to do, because it made the horror something more than a series of terrible events in isolated places. It made it a relationship. The Monster of Florence had turned to address the investigation directly, had found a way to enter the space of the investigation and the investigators themselves, to make them part of the experience. Silvia della Monica, who received the package, has spoken in accounts of the case about what it meant to handle that material, to understand what it was, and what its presence there meant. She continued the investigation. She was not the last magistrate to do so, and not the last to find herself more deeply inside the case than she had anticipated when it began. After 1985, the murders stopped, or at least the murders attributed with confidence to the monster stopped. No new crimes meeting the established pattern of the series have occurred since Scopetti, a cessation that has no more been explained than the similar cessation between 1974 and 1981 was explained. The killer may have died. He may have been imprisoned for an unrelated offense. He may have aged out of whatever compulsion drove the crimes. He may simply have stopped for reasons as opaque as everything else about him. The silence after 1985 is itself a kind of evidence, a negative space in the record that says something and refuses to say what. The investigation that had been building across those 17 years now turned its full force on the question of identification, and what followed was one of the most tortured and troubling episodes in Italian criminal justice history, a period in which the pressure to produce an answer overwhelmed, at several crucial points, the discipline to ensure that the answer was correct. By the late 1980s, the investigation had developed two major lines of inquiry. The first was the Sardinian Trail, the attempt to trace the gun from its likely Sardinian origins through a network of immigrants in the Florentine basin to whoever had ultimately possessed it during the years of the murders. This line of inquiry had produced a number of names, mostly connected to the Sardinian community that had settled in the Signa area in the 1960s and that had been implicated, directly or indirectly, in the circumstances of the 1968 murders. The second line of inquiry was the Compagnie di Menda theory, which proposed that the monster was not a lone individual, but a group, perhaps a small group of individuals who had participated in the murders together, and that the investigation of any single person was therefore missing the larger picture. The phrase compagni di menda, which translates roughly as companions in filth or shitty companions, was used by a young man named Fernando Pucci, who had himself been a suspect in the investigation and who, in exchange for leniency, had named a man he claimed to have seen in the hills on one of the nights in question. That man was Pietro Pacciani. Pietro Pacciani was 68 years old when the investigation focused on him, a farmer and former criminal from the village of Mercatale Val di Pesa in the Chianti Hills, south of Florence. His history included a conviction in 1951 for the murder of a traveling salesman who had been found with his fiancée in circumstances that Pacciani had considered compromising, a murder committed with a ferocity that involved stabbing the man more than 100 times. He had also been convicted of molesting 2 of his own daughters and had served a long prison sentence for this. He was, in short, a man whose history of violence against women and whose demonstrated capacity for catastrophic rage made him, from a profiling perspective, a plausible suspect for the monster murders. He was also elderly, physically unimpressive, essentially a peasant farmer from the Tuscan hills, and the gap between what the evidence suggested about the monster's operational intelligence and Pacciani's evident limitations was something that investigators and journalists noticed and debated from the beginning. He was arrested in 1993. His trial began in 1994 and was one of the most extensively covered events in Italian media during that period, a trial that generated the kind of sustained national attention that few criminal proceedings achieve, because it seemed to promise, at last, the closing of a wound that had been open in Italian society for more than 2 decades. Pacciani, in court, was a theatrical presence, alternately weeping and ranting and proclaiming his innocence in a dialect so thick that the court reporters struggled to transcribe it. He denied everything. He was outraged. He called himself a holy man, a man of God, who had been persecuted by the state. He was, in the observation of journalists and investigators who watched the proceedings, either genuinely innocent or a more accomplished performer than his background suggested. He was convicted in November of 1994. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. And then, in February of 1996, the Court of Appeal of Florence acquitted him on all charges, finding the evidence against him insufficient to sustain the conviction. The prosecution's case, which had relied heavily on witness testimony of uncertain reliability and on circumstantial evidence that the appeal court found inadequately corroborated by physical evidence, had not met the evidentiary standard the appellate court required. Pacciani, who had been released from prison pending the appeal, was a free man. He died in February of 1998, before the prosecution's appeal of his acquittal could be heard, found dead in his farmhouse, in circumstances that were initially suspicious enough to prompt a brief investigation, though the death was eventually attributed to natural causes, complicated by a lethal concentration of medication in his system. What the truth was, and what Pietro Pacciani actually knew about the Monster of Florence, died with him in that farmhouse in the Chianti Hills. 2 men named Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, both from the area around San Castiano Val di Pesa, were subsequently tried as the Compagni di Menda, the companions who had participated in the murders with Pacciani. The theory was that Pacciani had been the organizing figure, the monster himself, and that Vanni and Lotti had been his accomplices, present at some of the murders, participants in the violence. Lotti, a simple-minded man with a history of substance abuse and mental health difficulties, confessed. Vanni denied everything. Both were convicted, Vanni to life imprisonment and Lotti to a lesser sentence in recognition of his cooperation. Their convictions stand, but the question of whether they were actually present at the monster murders, whether the man who had held the gun across 17 years was the dead farmer from Mercatale Val di Pesa, whether the Compagni di Menda theory was an accurate account of what had happened in those hills, or an elaborate construction built on the testimony of unreliable witnesses and the investigative need to close a case that had become intolerable in its openness, is a question that Italian investigators and researchers and journalists have never stopped asking. Because there is a further dimension to the monster investigation, a dimension that begins to develop in the late 1990s and accelerates through the early 2000s, that takes the case from the merely disturbing into something genuinely labyrinthine, something that might, if you encountered it in a novel, seem excessive in its convolutions, its suggestions of power and conspiracy and institutional corruption, except that it is not a novel, and the people it affected were real. The theory that developed, pursued most aggressively by a group of prosecutors based in Perugia rather than Florence, was that the Monster of Florence was not simply a lone killer or a small group of companions, but rather the lowest level of a more elaborate criminal structure, a structure at whose upper reaches were powerful and wealthy members of Florentine society, men connected to occult organizations, possibly Freemasons, possibly members of some darker and more specifically sinister secret society, who had arranged for the murders to be committed and who had received the anatomical material removed from the female victims as offerings or trophies, as evidence of power over life and death, as the physical substance of a ritual that placed them somehow above or outside the ordinary moral and legal constraints that governed other people. This theory has been taken seriously, to varying degrees and with varying reservations, by different parts of the Italian investigative and journalistic establishment. It has produced prosecutions. It has produced convictions. It has also produced extraordinary abuses of investigative power, situations in which the pursuit of the elite conspiracy theory led prosecutors to turn their attention onto people who were investigating the case, rather than people who had committed crimes, people who had the misfortune of having gotten close enough to the investigation to be absorbed into it. The Perugian prosecutors who pursued the elite conspiracy angle were pursuing a theory with a long history in Italian culture, a history rooted in the real and well-documented existence of P2, the secret Masonic lodge whose membership included figures from across the Italian establishment and whose exposure in 1981 had revealed the extent to which shadowy informal networks of power operated behind the formal structures of the Italian state. P2 was real. The corruption it represented was real. The idea that something similar might be implicated in a crime series as extreme and as sustained as the monster murders was not, in that context, automatically dismissible as paranoia. But the translation of that general suspicion into specific accusations that required connecting specific named individuals to specific crimes through evidence that the accusers believed they had, and that independent evaluation frequently suggested they did not have, produced some of the most troubling episodes in the long, troubled history of this case. The pursuit of the elite conspiracy theory brought the investigation into contact with Douglas Preston, an American author who had moved with his family to Florence in 2000 to research a book about the Renaissance. Preston, who was by nature curious and by profession a writer drawn to narrative complexity, found himself drawn into the monster case through his friendship with Mario Spezzi, an Italian journalist who had covered the monster murders from the beginning and who had spent decades developing his own understanding of the case, an understanding that led him to conclusions about the likely perpetrator that differed significantly from the official prosecutorial line. Preston and Spezzi collaborated on a book, eventually published in 2008 under the title The Monster of Florence, that presented their investigation into the case and their conclusions about who the real killer had been, conclusions that did not involve Pietro Pacciani or the Perugian elite conspiracy theory. The book was a serious piece of work, carefully reported and clearly argued, and it made a significant contribution to the English language understanding of a case that had previously received relatively little attention outside Italy. It also made the two men targets of the investigation they were writing about. The prosecutor who had become the leading figure in the pursuit of the elite conspiracy theory was a man named Giuliano Mignini, based in Perugia, a deeply serious and deeply driven figure who had become convinced that the monster murders were connected to a satanic cult with links to Florentine high society. Mignini was also, not incidentally, the prosecutor who would later lead the initial investigation into the murder of Meredith Kircher in Perugia in 2007, a case that produced the conviction and eventual acquittal of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito, and that generated a secondary international controversy about Italian prosecutorial culture and the theory of complex criminal conspiracies in cases where the evidence pointed toward simpler explanations. In the Monster case, Mignini came to believe that Preston and Spezzi were not simply journalists and authors writing about the case, but were somehow implicated in it. Spezzi was arrested in 2006 and held in prison for 54 days before being released. He was accused of being part of a group that had committed crimes connected to the monster murders, accusations that most observers considered without credible foundation, accusations that Spezzi has denied entirely. Preston was interrogated by Italian police in a session that he has described in detail in the book and in subsequent interviews, an interrogation during which the questions put to him suggested that the investigators considered him not a witness or a journalist, but a potential suspect. He was advised to leave Italy, and he did. The accusations against Preston and Spezzi were eventually dropped. The case against those who had been named in connection with the elite conspiracy theory did not consistently produce sustainable convictions. The prosecutorial pursuit of the Monster case through the lens of Masonic lodges and satanic cults and powerful men receiving body parts as trophies had, by the early 2000s, consumed enormous investigative resources and produced an atmosphere of accusation and counter-accusation that had poisoned the public understanding of the case without advancing the factual understanding by any significant measure. What was left, after the Pacciani trial and acquittal, after the Compagni di Menda convictions, after the elite conspiracy investigations, after the interrogations of journalists who had gotten too close, was the case in its essential form, the form it had always occupied beneath all the theory and the prosecution. 16 dead, 8 couples, 17 years of murders in the hills above Florence, a gun that had been used across all of them and that had never been traced to a living person whose guilt could be established in court, and an official case that remained, for all the decades of effort and all the institutional energy expended on it, formally unsolved. The investigation remains technically open. The Italian judicial files on the Monster of Florence have never been closed in the way that cases are closed when someone is convicted and the conviction is final and the case is done. They remain open because the identity of the person who held the gun has never been conclusively established, because the trials that produced convictions for participation rather than for the central act of the killings themselves, because the man most firmly identified as the monster by the investigation's main line of inquiry died before the legal process that might have confirmed or disproven that identification could be completed. There is a particular kind of Italian social grief that attaches itself to the Monster case, a grief that is different from the grief of the victims' families, though it encompasses that grief, and different from the professional frustration of the investigators, though it encompasses that too. It is the grief of a place that was violated in a way that has never been answered, that has had to continue being beautiful under the weight of what happened within it. The Tuscan hills that appear in every painting of the ideal landscape, the hills that tourists from all over the world come to walk and drive and photograph, the hills that have been representing for centuries the idea of a benign and cultivated nature in harmony with human civilization, are also the hills where 8 couples were killed in the dark. That contradiction does not resolve. It persists. The landscape holds both things simultaneously, the beauty and the horror, and the impossibility of separating them is part of what makes the case so difficult to leave behind. Mario Spezzi, who had spent more than 30 years reporting on and investigating the monster, who had developed more detailed knowledge of the specific crimes and the specific investigation than almost any other person alive, died in 2016. He carried to his death a conviction about who the monster was, a conviction that his book with Preston presents at length, but that the legal process never confirmed or adopted. Whether he was right, whether the person he identified was the person who held the gun, whether the theory he developed across decades of careful and personally costly investigation represents the closest approach the case has produced to the truth, is something that cannot be established with the certainty that the case deserves and that its victims require. Douglas Preston, who came to Florence as a tourist of the Renaissance and left it carrying a legal file and a story that had changed him, has continued to write about the case in the years since the book's publication. He has noted, in several public accounts of the experience, that the monster investigation left him with a particular and lasting awareness of what happens to the pursuit of truth when institutions become more invested in the protection of a particular narrative about a crime than in the actual determination of what happened. The Italian judicial system, with all its genuine seriousness and genuine commitment to the forms of justice, had produced in the monster case a situation in which the pressure to name someone, to close the wound that the case represented, had resulted at various points in the wrong names being named, in innocent people being prosecuted, in investigators and journalists being turned into suspects, in a case that should have been about 16 dead people becoming, in its later decades, as much about the investigation itself as about the crimes the investigation was meant to resolve. This failure is not unique to Italy or to this case. The investigation of serial violence in any country, in any era, produces pressures, institutional and political and psychological, that work against the discipline that genuine investigation requires. The need to give the public an answer, to demonstrate that the state is capable of identifying and defeating the thing that has been operating in its midst, can overwhelm the obligation to ensure that the answer given is the correct one. The Monster of Florence investigation made this failure more visible than most, made it more sustained and more baroque in its specific manifestations. But it is a failure that lives inside every investigation of this kind, waiting for the moment when the pressure becomes sufficient to displace the truth. The beauty of the Tuscan hills at night is not diminished by what happened in them. The valleys still deepen into shadow. The cypresses still stand against the sky. The road still winds up through the olive groves, and the pine woods into the dark still leads to the small unpaved turnouts and the private places where the city lights are distant enough to seem irrelevant. People still drive those roads. Young couples still park in those secluded spots, because the generation that has grown up with the monster case as history rather than as living memory has the distance that time produces, the distance that makes the hills feel beautiful again without the specific anxiety that the same hills produced in the people who were young in Florence in the 1970s and 1980s, who learned to calculate the risk of where they parked and how far they were from other people, and who might be moving in the dark outside the car window. The 16 victims of the Monster of Florence were people who had not yet learned to be afraid of something they could not have known to fear. Stefania Pettini was 18 years old and parked on a country road in September with a 19-year-old boy, and she did not know that something was coming. Carmela Denuccio was 21 years old, and she did not know. Susanna Cambi was 24 years old. Pia Rontini was 18, the same age as Stefania Pettini, the same age as so many of the youngest victims across all the monster cases, 18 years old in the hills above Florence, and she did not know. What we know, and what they did not, is that something moved through those hills for 17 years, something that the best efforts of one of the oldest civilizations in the Western world, the country that invented the rule of law in its modern form, the country that produced the Renaissance, the country that made the most beautiful city in the world and placed it in the center of a landscape of such extraordinary and sustained beauty that it has been drawing people across the earth for 5 centuries to stand in it and be changed by it, was unable to find and hold and explain. Something moved through those hills and killed 16 people and was never caught, and the record of the attempt to catch it is in some ways as disturbing as the record of the crimes themselves, because it shows us the limits of what human institutions can do when they face something that does not want to be found and that the specific conditions of time and place and social circumstance conspire to keep hidden. The case is open. The files are there. The ballistic evidence from the gun, the casing signature that connected 8 crime scenes across 17 years, is in the record. The gun itself was never found. The person who held it was never definitively identified. Somewhere in the Italian judicial archive, in the thick folders and the photographs, and the forensic reports, and the witness statements, and the transcripts of trials that produced convictions that did not fully satisfy, and acquittals that did not fully relieve, the Monster of Florence remains what he has always been, a question that the landscape keeps asking, and the record has never answered. The hills are quiet now. The wine is made in the same valleys where the investigation searched. The tourists come every year in summer, and they walk the same roads, and they find the same beauty that has always been there, the beauty that makes the Tuscan countryside what it is, and what it has always been, which is to say, a place that feels, in the golden afternoon light, like the world as it was originally intended to be. And at night, when the light is gone and the valleys fill with shadow, and the narrow roads lead up through the dark into the places where you cannot see what is coming, the beauty is still there, underneath the dark, waiting for the morning, patient as the hills themselves, patient as everything that has survived across the long years of this unresolved and finally unanswerable question. Somewhere in those hills, the case persists. 16 names, 8 couples, 1 gun, no answer. The Monster of Florence has never been caught. Perhaps he is gone. Perhaps he is dead, his identity sealed with him in whatever earth received him. Perhaps somewhere in the Italian countryside, a man lived to an old age, knowing what he had done and carrying it quietly, and dying without disclosure, returning to the landscape he had made terrible, and being absorbed by it as the landscape absorbs everything, in the end, without ceremony and without confession. Or perhaps the truth is more complicated than that. Perhaps the truth about the Monster of Florence was always more than one person, more than one mind, more than one set of hands in the dark of the Tuscan hills. Perhaps the theories that seemed excessive were pointing at something real, and the failure was not the theory, but the execution, not the insight that something larger was present, but the inability to prove what the larger thing was. Perhaps the investigation that devoured itself in the pursuit of Masonic lodges and elite conspirators was wrong in its methods, but not entirely wrong in its instincts. We do not know. That is the truth of the case. The truth that every account of it eventually arrives at, and that no subsequent development has yet superseded. We do not know who the Monster of Florence was, or whether there was one monster or many, or what drove the thing that happened in those hills, or why it stopped when it stopped, or whether the people convicted of participating in the crimes were actually present at them, or whether the gun, if it still exists somewhere, would yield to the forensic capabilities of the present, the identification that it refused to yield to the capabilities of the past. Silvia de la Monica, the magistrate who received the package in October of 1985, the woman who opened an envelope in her office and found inside it something that spoke directly from the horror of the monster murders to the woman whose job was to find and stop that horror, has never spoken publicly with great detail about what that experience was like, about what it meant to be addressed in that way by the thing she was pursuing. Her discretion is understandable, and it deserves respect. But the image of that moment, the magistrate in her office, the package, the letter, the anatomical material that proved beyond any possible doubt that the sender had been at Scopetti in September, that he had been present there after the shooting and had taken something with him and had carried it for weeks before deciding to send it, before deciding that the investigation needed to know, needed to feel. The direct communication of what he was, the image of that moment, is where the case lives most vividly and most permanently, because it is the moment when the Monster of Florence was most clearly himself, when whatever was behind the gun and behind the knife and behind the terrible patience of 17 years of violence in the dark turned and looked directly at the people who were trying to find him and said, in the only language he had, "I am here." He was there. He is in the record. He is in the files and the ballistic reports, and the crime scene photographs, and the trial transcripts, and the books, and the documentaries, and the accounts of investigators who spent their careers trying to find him and did not quite succeed. He is in the silence after 1985, in the absence of crimes that never came. He is in the Tuscan landscape that he made something other than beautiful, that he made a place where the beauty coexists permanently with what it witnessed, where every unpaved turnout on a hillside road carries in its specific geography the memory of what once happened in places exactly like it. And he is in the unanswered question, which is the only place he has always been most comfortable, the only place where the identification that the investigation never made remains forever impossible. He is in the not knowing, in the open case, in the 16 names that the files carry and that the hills above Florence received and never gave back the truth of, in the dark, between the beauty and the horror, in the place where the two things meet and cannot be separated. He is there, in that place, still. To fully appreciate the gravity of what happened in the Florentine hills across those 17 years, it is necessary to spend more time with the investigation itself, with the specific mechanics of how Italian law enforcement attempted to respond to something that none of the established frameworks for criminal investigation had quite prepared them for. The Italian criminal justice system of the 1970s and 1980s was not a system designed for serial murder investigations. Serial killing, as a defined category of criminal behavior, was itself a relatively new concept, one that the FBI's behavioral science unit in Quantico was only beginning to formalize and articulate during precisely the years that the monster was active in Tuscany. The tools, the vocabulary, the investigative frameworks that would eventually become standard in the analysis of this kind of crime were being developed in America at the same time as the monster was developing his own terrible pattern in Italy, and the Italian investigators who were trying to catch him did not have access to those frameworks in anything like a timely way. What they had was the evidence at the scenes, the ballistic signature of the gun, the witness accounts that never quite produced a consistent description of a perpetrator, and the geographical pattern of the crimes, which were concentrated in a specific arc of countryside around the south and southwest of Florence, in the hills between the city and the wine country of Chianti, in the Mugello Valley to the north. This geographical concentration was significant because it spoke to someone with specific local knowledge, someone who knew the roads and the turnouts and the unpaved tracks through the woods, someone who moved through that landscape with the ease of familiarity rather than the uncertainty of a stranger. He had navigated those dark roads in the years before he used them for what he ultimately used them for, had identified the specific locations in advance, had understood what the geography offered him in terms of approach and escape, and the specific kind of privacy that the darkness between the hills provided. The investigators who built this picture of the monster's geographical relationship to the landscape did so through the painstaking and time-consuming process of mapping every crime scene, measuring distances and travel times, identifying the approach routes and the exit routes, trying to understand the operational logic of a killer who had returned to a specific kind of location across 17 years without ever using the same location twice. There was method in the geography. There was a consistency that spoke to someone who understood the territory not as a tourist understands it, appreciating its beauty and moving through it in the daylight, but as a local understands it, knowing which roads were watched and which were not, which turnouts were visible from passing traffic and which were effectively invisible, where the darkness was deepest and the likelihood of accidental discovery was lowest. Inspector Ruggero Perugini, the man who would eventually develop the compagni di Menda theory, was a pioneering figure in the Italian adoption of what was then being called criminal profiling, a discipline he had studied partly through contact with American investigators at the FBI. Perugini brought to the monster investigation a way of thinking about the crimes that was more systematic and more psychologically oriented than the Italian investigative tradition had previously produced in this context, a way of reasoning from the evidence at the crime scenes backward toward the characteristics of the person who had left that evidence. His profile of the monster, developed across his years on the case, suggested a man of a specific type, someone with a detailed knowledge of the Florentine countryside who had moved through it unnoticed across 2 decades, someone whose social presentation was sufficiently normal to avoid the sustained suspicion of neighbors and colleagues, someone whose violence was not random but purposeful in ways that spoke to a specific and organized pathology. This profile was useful in the sense that it gave investigators a framework for thinking about the kind of person they were looking for, rather than simply accumulating evidence and hoping that a name would eventually emerge from it. It was also limited in the way that all profiles of unknown subjects are limited, because the inference from crime scene evidence to perpetrator characteristics involves a degree of uncertainty that the apparent confidence of the profile tends to obscure, and because the framework was built primarily on American case studies whose applicability to the specific cultural context of rural Tuscany was not always straightforward. The monster case generated, across its active years and the decades of investigation that followed, an extraordinary body of forensic and investigative documentation, the kind of accumulation of detail that a case attracts when it runs long enough and generates enough public pressure to keep official resources focused on it, even through the dry periods when no new evidence is emerging. The case files are massive. The ballistic reports alone run to hundreds of pages, each analyzing the same gun from the same casings across the same crime scenes, each confirming what had been confirmed before and adding nothing new about who had held it. The witness interview records stretch across thousands of pages, recording the accounts of hundreds of people who had lived in or near the areas where the crimes occurred, who had seen something, or thought they had seen something, or had been told by someone else who had seen something. None of it produced the break that investigation requires, the specific piece of information that connects a known person to the physical evidence in a way that is sustainable in court. The monster's operational discipline, the care with which he had avoided leaving behind anything that could be traced directly to him, was as evident in the record of the failed investigation as it was in the crime scenes themselves. He had not been careless. He had not, across 17 years and 8 crimes, produced a single fingerprint on a surface that was recovered, a single biological trace in a form that the forensic science of the era could process into an identification. The technology of the time was not adequate to the task of extracting identification from the kind of trace evidence that might have been present at the scenes, and by the time the technology improved sufficiently to make such extraction theoretically possible, the evidence had been through decades of handling and storage that had degraded whatever might have remained. The failure was not for want of effort. The investigators who worked the monster case across its various phases included some of the most experienced and dedicated members of Italian law enforcement, men and women who brought genuine ability and genuine commitment to a case that never gave them what they needed. Perugini developed an investigation that, at its peak, had hundreds of people working directly on the Monster case across multiple agencies. The examination of suspects, the checking of alibis, the cross-referencing of the geographical patterns with the known movements of people who had come under suspicion was extensive and systematic in a way that the early responses to the murders had not been. What it was not, finally, was sufficient. The relationship between the Monster case and the broader landscape of Italian criminal investigation in the 1980s and 1990s is worth examining, because the Monster case was not occurring in isolation. Italy in those years was dealing with the aftermath of the years of lead, the Mani Pulite corruption investigations that dismantled the established political order, the continuing power of organized crime in the South, and a general atmosphere of institutional crisis that made the failure to resolve a major criminal case feel like one more symptom of institutional inadequacy. The Monster case became, in the public imagination, a symbol of the state's inability to protect its citizens from the worst things that human beings are capable of, and this symbolic weight made the investigation subject to political pressures that investigations should not be subject to, pressures that pushed investigators toward conclusions and toward prosecutorial decisions that the evidence did not fully support. The Pacciani trial was the most visible manifestation of these pressures. Pietro Pacciani, whatever the full truth of his relationship to the Monster murders, was tried and convicted and acquitted in a sequence that reflected the contradictions running through the investigation rather than the settled determination of the evidence. The conviction represented the investigative establishment's best case, built over years of work and presented to a court that found it sufficient. The acquittal represented the appellate court's assessment that sufficiency had not been achieved, that the case against Pacciani was too reliant on testimony that could not be independently corroborated, on inference that had not been adequately grounded in physical evidence, on the institutional momentum of an investigation that needed an answer more than it had, perhaps, the answer itself. The aftermath of the Pacciani acquittal, the period in which the investigation continued with the Compagni di Menda theory as its organizing frame, produced its own extraordinary episodes. The prosecution of Vanni and Lotti raised questions that have never been satisfactorily resolved about the extent to which a coerced or encouraged confession from an unreliable witness can serve as a reliable foundation for a criminal conviction. Giancarlo Lotti's confession, on which much of the case against both men depended, was given by a man of limited intelligence in circumstances that defense attorneys and independent observers found troubling, circumstances in which the line between the witness's independent recollection and the investigator's preferred narrative had been blurred in ways that the record does not entirely allow to disentangle. Mario Espezzi, who covered the Pacciani trial and the subsequent proceedings for La Nazione, the Florentine newspaper for which he had written about the Monster since the earliest murders, developed across those years a deep skepticism about the official case. A skepticism grounded not in any sympathy for the accused, but in a journalistic assessment of the evidence that led him to conclude that the investigation had, at some crucial point, gone in the wrong direction and had continued in that direction through sheer institutional momentum long after the evidentiary foundation for the direction should have been recognized as insufficient. His own investigation, conducted in parallel with the official one, led him toward different names, different locations, a different narrative of who had done these things and why, a narrative that he shared with Douglas Preston and that formed the core of their book. Whether Spezzi was right is something that cannot be determined with the certainty it deserves, because the people he named in his own investigation have not been tried, and the evidence he assembled, however carefully and however convincingly presented in the book, was never subjected to the rigorous testing that a trial process imposes. The Italian judicial system's response to his investigation, rather than engaging with it on its merits, was to treat it as evidence of Spezzi's own involvement in something criminal, an investigative response that most serious observers considered a profound institutional failure, a moment when the investigation became more interested in protecting itself from challenge than in pursuing the truth it was supposed to be seeking. The Douglas Preston episode is perhaps the element of the Monster case that is most instructive for what it reveals about how criminal investigations can go wrong when they become sufficiently pressured and sufficiently self-protective. Preston was an American citizen who had no legal jeopardy in Italy, who had come to the country for entirely benign reasons, and had become entangled in the Monster investigation through the specific combination of intellectual curiosity, friendship with Spezzi, and the kind of narrative instinct that drives writers toward the most complex and consequential stories in their vicinity. His interrogation by Italian investigators, his advice to leave the country, the formal investigation of him as a potential suspect in crimes that were decades old and in which he had no conceivable involvement, constituted a misuse of investigative authority that was both a violation of his rights and a waste of investigative resources that could have been spent pursuing the actual perpetrators of the crimes. The broader trajectory of Giuliano Mignini's career, from the Monster investigation to the Amanda Knox case, has been examined by legal scholars and journalists as a pattern that raises questions about the specific prosecutorial culture within which such a career could develop and sustain itself, questions about accountability and oversight and the mechanisms by which prosecutorial excess is checked in the Italian system. These are important institutional questions, and they deserve serious examination independent of any conclusions about the specific cases. But in the context of the Monster investigation, they matter most for what they reveal about how the pursuit of the truth about the 8 double murders in the Florentine hills was finally, and perhaps decisively, derailed by the very investigation that was supposed to be pursuing it. The victims are the constant against which all of this must be measured. 16 people who went to the hills above Florence for the most ordinary of human reasons, for privacy and the specific intimacy that privacy makes possible, for the simple and unremarkable desire to be alone with someone they cared about in a landscape that promised nothing more threatening than a beautiful night. They deserved the safety of that landscape. They deserved what the hills, at their most benign, offered anyone who came to them: the darkness that shelters, the distance from the city that reduces its noise, the specific pleasure of being somewhere that is not quite civilized, somewhere that the old beauty of the Tuscan countryside offers as a reprieve from the ordinary demands of daily life. What they got instead was something the landscape had never promised and had never before delivered, something that used the same darkness and the same distance and the same separation from the watchful eyes of the city to cover a violence of a specific and sustained character that the beautiful hills had never been asked to bear before and have not, in the decades since, been asked to bear again. The landscape survived. The hills are still there. The wine is still made. The tourists still come in summer. The cypresses still stand against the sky. The 16 dead are still dead. Their names are in the record, in the files, in the cold official language of Italian criminal procedure and the warmer human language of the books and articles and documentaries that have tried to give them something more than the bureaucratic notation of their deaths. But their names are not as well remembered as the name of the case that carries the identity of the man who killed them, instead of their own identities. This is the final injustice of the case, the injustice that no subsequent resolution of the investigative failures could repair, that the Monster of Florence has been given more narrative space in the history of this crime than the people he killed, that the question of who he was has occupied more cultural attention than the question of who they were. Antonio Lobianco, Barbara Locci, Pasquale Gentilcore, Stefania Pettini, Giovanni Foggi, Carmela Denuccio, Stefano Baldi, Susanna Cambi, Paolo Mainardi, Antonella Migliorini, Horst Wilhelm Meyer, Uwe Rüdiger Rusch, Claudio Stefanacci, Pia Rontini, Jean-Michel Kraveishvili, Nadine Mauriot. These are the names. These are the people. They were in the hills on those nights, for all the human reasons people go to hills on warm nights, and what they encountered there they did not survive, and the world that failed to protect them also failed to find an answer for the thing that had taken them. That failure is the open wound at the center of the case, a wound that the decades have not healed, and the official record has not closed, and the beautiful Tuscan landscape holds in its geography, quietly and without remedy, in the dark between the hills where the Monster of Florence moved and killed and was never found, where the question that should have an answer still does not have one, where the case file has never been closed and the truth has never been delivered, and where 16 names wait, in the permanent suspension of the unresolved and the unaccountable, for a justice that has not yet come. It is enough to say, finally, that the hills remember what they received, even if they cannot speak it, that the darkness between the cypress trees is the same darkness that sheltered the violence, that the roads winding up into the evening hills are the same roads that were driven by someone who returned, again and again, to take what he came to take, and then disappear back into the ordinary life that surrounded the murders without ever being separated from it. That somewhere in the Florentine countryside a story was lived that the record has preserved only in the negative, only in the shape of the absence it produced, only in the 16 names that survived the people they belonged to, and in the open file, and in the question that the file has never answered, and in the dark. There is one more dimension of the monster case that deserves sustained attention, because it is the dimension that most directly connects the murders to the larger world in which they occurred, and that most clearly illustrates the specific conditions under which the investigation became what it became. Italy in the 1970s and 1980s was a country whose relationship with its own institutions had been profoundly destabilized by events that made even the most solid-seeming official structures feel contingent and vulnerable. The revelation of the P2 Masonic Lodge in 1981, with its membership list encompassing senior military officers, magistrates, politicians, journalists, and businessmen bound by secret oaths and committed to an agenda that had operated for years in the shadow of the official Italian state, confirmed for many Italians what they had long suspected, that the country was governed, in significant measure, by networks of power that operated outside the formal structures of democratic accountability, that the men who held the visible offices were not necessarily the men who held the real power, and that the gap between what the state appeared to be and what it actually was could be very large. In this context, the theory that the Monster of Florence was connected to a network of powerful and wealthy individuals who had arranged the murders and who received the removed anatomical material as trophies of their power was not simply a paranoid fantasy. It was, for many Italians who had lived through the P2 revelations, a theory that fit the pattern of how power operated in their country, the pattern of hidden networks and secret arrangements and ordinary appearances masking extraordinary abuses. The theory was wrong, or at least the specific version of it that the Peruvian prosecutors pursued was never substantiated by evidence sufficient to sustain a criminal conviction. But it was not simply irrational, and the eagerness with which portions of the Italian press and public adopted it reflected something real about the cultural moment in which it appeared. The specific mechanics of the theory, as it developed in the hands of the Peruvian prosecutors, deserve examination, both for what they reveal about the investigation's trajectory and for the specific way in which they distorted the pursuit of the truth about the murders. The core claim was that the monster, whoever he was, had not been acting alone or entirely on his own initiative, but had been part of a broader arrangement in which the murders served a purpose beyond the immediate violence, a purpose defined by the desires and demands of a group of powerful individuals who were receiving from the monster evidence of the crimes as a condition of the arrangement. The specific group proposed by the prosecutors was a secret sect, sometimes described as satanic, sometimes as more broadly occult in its orientation, that had allegedly included among its membership prominent figures in Florentine professional and cultural life. The names that appeared in connection with this theory included a doctor, several lawyers, a pharmacist, a landowner, individuals whose connection to the murders was established, in the prosecutor's accounting, through a combination of witness testimony, of questionable reliability, and circumstantial evidence that the accused and their defenders considered wholly insufficient. Some of these individuals were investigated. Some were charged. The trials that resulted produced a complicated record of convictions and acquittals and appeals that has never fully resolved into a clear account of what was true and what was not, in part because the investigation itself had become so entangled in its own theories by the time the trials began that the separation of fact from inference had become genuinely difficult even for the participants. The most striking thing about the elite conspiracy theory, viewed from the distance of the decades that have passed since its most active prosecution, is not that it was pursued, but that it consumed so much of the available investigative energy during a period when the actual physical evidence, the ballistic evidence from the gun, the geographical analysis of the crime scenes, the profile of the monster that the crime scene analysis supported, pointed in directions that were considerably more specific and considerably more tractable than the theory of an occult network of powerful men receiving body part trophies. The theory was large enough to accommodate almost any new piece of information, flexible enough to absorb contradictions, and sufficiently dramatic in its implications to generate the kind of sustained institutional energy that less spectacular theories might not have been able to maintain. This is a recognized pathology of criminal investigations, particularly of investigations into serious crimes that have generated significant public and political pressure. When the obvious explanations have been tried and failed, and when the pressure to produce an answer has not diminished, the temptation to reach for more elaborate explanations that can account for the failure of the simpler ones is very powerful. The elaborate explanation serves the institution because it reframes the investigation's lack of success as evidence of the adversary's sophistication rather than evidence of the investigation's limitations. If the monster has not been caught, it is because the monster is protected by powerful people. If the Pacciani conviction did not survive appeal, it is because the network reached into the courts. The theory is self-sealing in a way that simpler theories are not, and its self-sealing quality made it both resistant to disproof and ultimately destructive of the discipline that the investigation required. The physical evidence of the gun is the anchor that all theories must account for, and it is the piece of evidence that the elite conspiracy theory has always struggled most to explain. The .22 long rifle Beretta, with its specific and identifiable ballistic signature, was in someone's hands across 8 crime scenes. That person, whoever they were, had a physical relationship with the gun that extended over 17 years, a relationship involving storage and maintenance and deployment across multiple crimes, a relationship that required specific practical decisions about where to keep it, how to transport it, how to ensure it remained functional across the years between some of the crimes. The gun's physical history is the closest the case comes to a biography of the monster, and it is a biography that suggests a person of specific characteristics, a person embedded in the landscape of the Florentine countryside in a specific way, a person whose operational decisions across 17 years reflected a practical knowledge of the territory and a practical intelligence about the risks of his activities. Whether that person was Pietro Pacciani, as the prosecution maintained, or someone else, as Spezzi and Preston and various other investigators and journalists have argued, the character of the person that the gun's history describes is not the character of someone who was operating as the lowest level of an elaborate criminal hierarchy, collecting anatomical material to order for powerful patrons. The specificity of the monster's operational pattern, the consistency of his approach and his method and his geographical focus, speaks to someone for whom the violence was its own purpose, someone whose compulsion was self-directed rather than externally organized. This does not mean that the monster was acting in complete isolation, that no one in his immediate social world had any awareness of what he was or what he was doing. Serial killers rarely live in a social vacuum, and the people in their vicinity often have, in retrospect, a recognition of something that they did not know how to name or how to report at the time. But it does suggest that the elaborate architecture of the Compagni di Menda and the elite patrons and the trophies delivered to powerful men was built on something other than the actual operational reality of the monster's crimes. Mario Spezzi's death in 2016 was mourned by the Italian journalistic community and by the broader community of people who had followed the monster case across the decades of his involvement with it. He had given more of his professional life to this case than to any other, had lived with it through the years when it was a live criminal matter, and through the longer years when it was a cold case, still technically open and still theoretically susceptible to resolution, had developed a relationship with its specific complexity that was unlike anything else in his career. Whether his conclusions about who the monster was were correct is a question that his death made permanently unanswerable in the specific way that he might have answered it, the way that comes from continuing to pursue the evidence until it resolves or definitively refuses to resolve. The theory he left behind is in the record. It is available for evaluation. It has not, in the years since the book was published, been officially adopted by Italian investigators, but it has also not been officially refuted, and it remains one of the more serious and carefully argued contributions to the case's impossible bibliography. Douglas Preston's experience in Italy, the interrogation, the advice to leave the country, the formal investigation of him as a suspect, eventually became material for the book in a way that added a dimension to the narrative that no one had anticipated when the collaboration between him and Spezzi began. The story of two writers investigating a cold case and becoming subjects of that investigation themselves, the story of an American trying to understand the Italian justice system from the inside of its most bizarre episode, gave the book a quality that pure reportage on the crimes might not have had, a quality of immediate and personal jeopardy that made the institutional dysfunction of the investigation feel concrete rather than abstract. The monster had been dead or absent for more than 2 decades by the time Preston arrived in Italy, but the investigation he had generated was still capable of producing its own particular violence, the violence of false accusation, the violence of institutional power directed at the people who were trying to tell the truth about it. This secondary violence, the violence of the investigation itself directed at the wrong people, is an important part of the full accounting of what the Monster of Florence produced in the world. The primary victims were the 16 people killed in the hills. The secondary victims were the people caught in the machinery of an investigation that consumed itself, and in doing so, consumed others. The suspects who were wrongly accused, the witnesses whose testimony was shaped by pressure into something other than the truth, the journalists and researchers who found themselves on the wrong side of investigators who had come to see any challenge to their conclusions as evidence of participation in the conspiracy they were pursuing. The Monster of Florence case is, in the end, a lesson about multiple kinds of failure simultaneously. It is a lesson about the failure of the investigative apparatus to catch a killer whose crimes spanned 17 years and 8 scenes in a specific and identifiable geographical area. It is a lesson about the failure of the prosecutorial apparatus to resist the pressure to produce an answer at the cost of the accuracy of the answer. It is a lesson about the failure of institutional accountability, about how investigations that are sufficiently pressured and sufficiently self-protective can devour not only the truth they are supposed to be seeking, but also the people who are trying to help them find it. And it is a lesson about the failure of the culture that absorbed the monster case as a narrative, that followed the trials and the theories and the Baroque elaborations of the elite conspiracy angle with the fascination of an audience watching a drama, while the specific and irreplaceable human beings at the center of the case, the 16 dead in the hills above Florence, waited for a justice that has not yet arrived. The hills above Florence, on a warm September evening, are a specific and beautiful place. The sun goes down, and the shadows lengthen in the valleys, and the city below begins to light up in the dusk, a city of extraordinary beauty, visible from the roads and the turnouts in the hills, a city that represents, to the people who know its history and its art, something like the best of what human civilization has made. The Monster of Florence lived within that beauty. He moved through it in the dark. He used its specific geography, its particular darkness, its sheltered and private places, for the worst of what human beings have ever done to each other. And whatever drove him to do what he did across those 17 years, whatever it was that he was when the gun was not in his hand, when he was driving home through the dark hills with whatever he had done behind him and the lights of Florence ahead, is something the record does not know, and the investigation did not find, and the decades since have not revealed. What remains is what has always remained: the hills, and the names, and the open file, and the question,